Panel, two things in this speech. First of all, we're going to explain to you why we get a more effective allocation of resources in these local communities and massively benefit their growth and their own sense of community. And secondly, we're going to talk to you about the buy-in, both to the systems of government within these areas and also into a sense of community that these individuals have that they otherwise will not have. First of all, we're going to outline how we would use this mechanism. The context slide says that it's a predefined sum of money. What we would consider this to be, that we're going to define from the outset, is the current amount of financial money that had been previously allocated for local expenditure to these areas, as well as the local taxes in those areas that had been allocated for local government. So these organisations will have all tax revenue that's raised will go to them. We would also give these organisations tax varying powers. That is to say, they can put weights of taxation on things like property and education and income in those areas that they can then use. In terms of selection of these individuals, we would hold elections. We would have these individuals be voted in. We understand there are some parts of the world where democracy in the developing world isn't as sufficient as others. But we would like to point out to you that there's degrees of local democracy in most parts of the world. China, for example, does have some degree of local elections. In some parts of the world, these tend to be independent. Wait for me to finish. These tend to be non-party elections or independent elections, so as not to challenge that governmental authority. But we do agree that there's some capacity for the selectorate in that area to do so within the frameworks of the selection processes that exist. Back half clarification.
How does this differ from the regular process of electing a representative?
Because under status quo, much of the financial allocation is ultimately decided by federalised governments in those areas, or in many of the instances, the financial allocation is heavily influenced by the federal government, or more likely, when you make financial decisions, they are vetoed by the federal government because they are deemed to not be in the capacity of the strategic economic plan for those areas. What we are basically saying is localised authorities now will have the capacity and strength to say, this is what we want for our area, this is what we are spending it with, and the federalised civil servants simply cannot tell us no. Whatever limitations are, we have full sovereignty over how we spend that money. That is a push even on localised government context, even in the developed world that don't have that much level of authority. First of all, on allocation of resources. We think the biggest problem under status quo in terms of the principal agent problem that occurs within the developing world is ultimately spillage of the allocation of resources. That is to say, money is allocated towards local communities by federalised leaders or by centralised leaders who tend to spend that money in a manner that is not as effective or is not as well informed by the information on the ground. In many cases, the allocation of that resources are simply corrupt. They are given in contexts that are not effective. They are allocated to political cronies, and they're getting the support and the media systems in these societies aren't effectively able to call them out at a federal level. The comparative here is at a localised level. It is infinitely more easier to call that out because there's a direct, meaningful experience. But also in many of these societies, politics are heavily ethnically driven. So ultimately, the localised context about what is happening in your community isn't one that's meaningfully that important to you because you want to vote in an ethnic manner to preserve your own interests in a tribalised context. However, when you are voting in a homogenised context within your local community, that then fundamentally changes, because instead you are going to vote for not who you need to keep in control for your own ethnic status, but instead on the people who are misallocating resources. Now they might respond to that and say, oh well look, at the end of the day, why can't local government resources engage also in crony capitalism and allocate those resources unfairly? We would posit at the point in which it is being done, no thank you, it is being done at a local level, you still have a situation whereby that finances, even if it is being done in a crony manner, it is at least going within and being spent within that local community in a way there was no guarantee it would have been if it hadn't been spent by those federal individuals. Ultimately, we think there are significant problems as well to do with high rates of tax avoidance within these societies. We think we deconstruct the amount of avoidance of tax at the point in which these resources are considered as being more effectively spent within those communities on procedures that are beneficial. Because we also posit that when money is coming down from the top and being allocated, this is not effective in societies that have not built up very sophisticated, very complex civil service systems and economic matrices, so means of spending money from the top down. When you don't have those built up in hugely vast countries, you make procedural difficulties when individuals on the ground would be far better off in doing that. On their side of the house, yes, there is local governments that can advise and say what they think is needed, but ultimately the strategic national plan of the economies of these countries always comes first. The interest of what's happening in the big cities, of the dominant economic groups, will always benefit there. There's little consideration for those people who are ultimately at the ground. Because it's important to bear in mind, those on the bottom are ultimately better informed about what they need on a day-to-day basis. This is things like they need more wells, they need more roads, they need more infrastructural capacity, they know exactly what their culture needs, and wait 15 seconds please. An example of this is, for example, in Ghana, where there's a massive wind turbine project where the entire country was building huge sums of wind turbines simply as part of a large large-scale national energy project. Local government authorities on the ground said, look, we don't actually have sufficient amount of wind to do this. If you build these wind turbines, nothing will happen. Of course, high-ranking civil servants who had a strategic plan for their country, that they had incentives to continue to spend this money and have energy ministers who commanded their own influence and capacity and plans, simply would have no incentive to listen to them. On our side of the house, we will ensure that local government finances that can make an enormous, huge difference in people's lives in terms of the infrastructure they need on the ground to stimulate their own economies, to send people to better schools, to give people the transport links they need to get places to work, to go and have infrastructure repaired in their schools and their wells, and that they would otherwise now just simply does happen. This is meaningful local control of this economic resources that do not otherwise exist on their side of the house. Secondly, regarding buy-in. First of all, we think in the context of where we have people used to engaging in a democratic process that is meaningful in their lives. Because in many of these countries where the voting processes do happen, it's either that there is very little local elections under status quo, or there are national elections which are not terminized in meaningful economic decision making. It is ultimately you just vote for the ethnic party who you want to vote for, or ultimately you vote for someone and you see it's the kind of same corrupt capacity always happening and the amount of selection you have is very minimal. What we say is you get more people to buy into democratic systems at the point in which you make it very meaningful in their day-to-day life. No, thank you. Ultimately, it becomes about things like simple, reasonable questions about their lives. Like, how long is it going to take my kid to get to school in the morning? When am I going to have access to infrastructure that my child or my family meaningfully needs? When is our local agricultural systems going to get the irrigation systems that we need to be better able to produce? Where I can now see exactly where in my local community that taxation revenue is going, instead of it going to a capital city I have never been to, that I don't recognize anyone from, has no one of my ethnicity, that then gets reallocated to those local government authorities, that those local government authorities then have to spend in a way when their hands are tied behind their back and are greatly limited, which means that buy-in doesn't happen. The outcome you get there is more people turning up to vote, it's more people being engaged in local conversations about where their society is going, and it's more people buying in and listening to the politics. But it also makes them believe that politics ultimately can work for them. It makes them buy into the state, it makes them buy into their community, it makes them more and more interested and concerned about where the money that they spend in taxation is going, and it makes them more civic citizens. It builds a infrastructure where people can begin to look at also higher up systems and ask themselves what's happening. But it also allows laboratories of experimentation, because different communities can try different things out, and when certain things work in certain areas, it can be adapted elsewhere. Because instead you just have one federalized government trying one thing. This is why in the economic liberalization in China, the special economic zones were meaningfully successful because of the autonomy and control they were given over local finances. Very, very happy to propose. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Speaker for the opening opposition speech.
We good? Three things in this speech. Firstly, why local people's incentives are always going to be comparatively worse than governments. Even at the point where they are legitimate, they are often misguided because of, one, a lack of oversight, but also a tie to the industries and the communities they do. So often they make decisions that are against their own interest despite the legitimacy. Then why we think we get less foreign direct investment, and the point where you question the stability and the legitimacy of these places, and a trade-off there. I think the framing, though, to bear in mind here is twofold. Firstly, I think under the status quo, a lot of the developing countries have limited resources to use. They are often they often have lower GDPs because they've had less chance to develop. I think that's intuitive, but also they are often governments that are often smaller, lower populations, so they've not had a huge amount of time to build up things like tax revenue to be able to invest in infrastructure. That means that these developing nations just need to make decisions of the most efficient allocation of resources possible, because this is the difference between making good decisions that can benefit your community and country into the interim. I think it is also useful to notice that it is an urgent one. At the point where you slow development in any meaningful way, in any capacity, you are limiting the access to employment for individuals. That means they get less access to wealth and are able to improve their economic standing and protect their lives and families, etc. Even if OG get to stand behind a MEC that is clearly incorrect, because notice in the info slide it states it is ordinary citizens that have to stand behind this, but even if, we're going to tell you why local government probably have worse incentives anyway. Why are the people's incentives, no thank you, why are people's incentives worse? Firstly, I think even at the local government level, you're just more likely to prioritize your family and people you care about. But why? Firstly, because you're just an intuitively selfish person. I think comparatively, governments are probably more likely to have more direct oversight. Probably you are more likely to make sufficient, more meaningful or more direct calculations of where money goes more efficiently because you don't have that personal tie in yourself. But secondly, also I just think you have different incentives, right? People have different jobs in different communities. They often have different priorities about where they want money to go, probably care about getting subsidies to come to them, crucially, versus the other people or their neighbours. I think that's something that is intuitive. I think people are just inherently selfish. But secondly, in terms of just the less amount of knowledge, you have less knowledge to see where money needs to go desperately, because often, even in smaller communities, there are likely to be divides along religious lines or along things about where the money needs to go desperately. You also might not know the jobs that necessarily are being or the communities or the industries or the types of jobs that are most in desperate need of funding. So often these things will go unfunded because communities will just not realise or not value it because of these divides, but also because of the self-incentives I've talked to you about. But crucially and most importantly, often in these communities, they have historical ties to certain sectors or certain things. Like in Greece, there is a historical tie in lots of rural areas to agriculture, despite the fact that climate change literally means that agriculture is not going to be a profitable industry in 10 years' time. But secondly, in terms of the people care naturally have an instinct to want to do things they've done forever. They want to build upon resources that they know, on methods they know to build up resources that they have seen historically guarantee them income. But crucially, they won't realise and can't differentiate between on their side. I think what that means is it looks like communities literally investing disproportionately in things like agriculture or tourism, which are not, firstly, they are often businesses and industries that are not reliable in the long term, often less guaranteed of income into perpetuity, often because they are seasonal work. But I think what that means specifically is that means you have communities making mistakes about where they put money. I think that means instead of putting it into things like transport, not just necessarily in your area, because sure, maybe a road in your town is fine, but you need roads outside it for industries to be able to come in, lorries to be able to come back and forth, to be able to make sure supply chains run effectively. I think it is important to notice here that even at the point where they presume that these interests are legitimate, often they are just not consequentially useful. I'll explain why that's probably harmful in that way, because for the reason I give you in my framing, but also for why we get less foreign direct investment in the future. Sure, I'll take back that.
You say people have families and they care about them. Local representatives also have families, and when they're the only ones who control the money, of course they're going to give the money to their families. But
that's literally opening government's neck, right? They've just stood behind local governments doing it. I think the crucial thing to note here is if this is a comparative way up, I've given you reasons why specifically if we're talking about a national government doing this, or even a representative parliament, they probably have less ties to that community directly, so can make less emotive decisions, probably ones that are more willing to take into calculus, but they're probably just more qualified to make those decisions. They probably have policy makers. They probably at least have a basic understanding of the principles of economics and development economics comparative to these communities, ones where they can make better decisions in that way. Why are governments less corrupt than literally local communities? And this is and even if we're taking opening government at their best, and this is local representation, why that happens. Firstly, you just have more capacity to do things like intimidate your neighbour when you're a local government rather than a national one, because of the selfish incentives, but crucially because you just have the capacity. You have a monopoly of violence comparable to the state. The state probably doesn't want to intimidate you or use that apparatus because it's not in their interest, because it's not in their direct interest specifically. But also, you just, in these communities, it's very easy to do so because you know how to blackmail people. You know what'll hurt people. You know what things and what divides are easy to manipulate. I think that makes things like blackmail and things like escalating conflict and that sort of thing more likely to happen. Comparatively, I just think governments don't have that incentive because they are not so tied, but also specifically because business owners in these areas have a specific incentive to be like, look, I want this subsidy to come to me, so I will intimidate other business owners, smaller business owners, into giving me those subsidies. And I think what that means is you get disparate deviations of wealth. It means things like the wealth gap increases because the richest people who have the most access to be able to brutalize and intimidate probably will still happen under the status quo. That's a harm. That's probably a harm. That's probably detrimental to development. Finally, why do we think we get the lack of FDI? For a couple of reasons. I think firstly, it's important to note why businesses go into these areas or want to put foreign direct investment in the first place. Firstly, they probably want to they're making a calculation of risk to be able to get profit out of building businesses in this first place. But secondly, they just probably have some I think they just make a calculation of risk and probably want to directly guarantee a rate of return on that profit, because often we're talking about large scale investments here. Why does this change under their side? Firstly, stereotypes of the developing world get worse on their side because already businesses see the developing world through racist narratives about who is competent and who deserves money and who is a secure investment. Comparatively, national governments probably have the prestige of being a national government in the first place, probably have representatives that go onto the international stage and can claim that they are ones that are necessarily involved. I think comparatively, if even if it's ordinary citizens or local governments making these direct claims, these stereotypes go up, and probably these are less likely to happen. But crucially, I think it is just considered a more risky investment to put it in the hands of ordinary citizens literally just for obvious, for obvious superficial reasons because of that. But thirdly, you're just less likely to have a direct control of this money as a business. Because crucially, assuming you're dealing with really, really big concepts, presumably they only can come together maybe once or twice a year. We're talking about whole communities of ordinary citizens deviating up. So that's probably you can make a decision one year that immediately changes the next, comparative to a government that probably has electoral incentives to stay consistent as long as possible. I think that means two things. I think governments are businesses are less likely to want to invest. I think that has two problems, especially given the framing I tell you at the beginning. GDP and the ability to develop relies upon influxes of cash. At the end of this debate, you can very clearly think that we're going to get more money, more development, and better quality of life for people. Opposed.
Thank that speaker very much, and I call upon the second speaker from the opening props team. Here.
Madam Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, two things in this speech. Firstly, why these services are better, and secondly, why are local officials far more accountable. Firstly, on why are these services better. I'll note that this LO did not respond to a crucial plank of our case, which is that a serious problem in many developing countries around the world is a failure to effectively collect taxes. Understand what that means for this debate. Even if you think that these services are worse allocated, if they're worse kinds of services, if we prove that there actually is far more revenue going into these organizations, then obviously we get more of services being built and we get a better sense of that. Why aren't people paying taxes at the moment? The first thing is that there is a collective action problem for communities who don't have a sense of civic duty in places where the ability to collect tax as a result of sophisticated mechanisms that developed countries have, so for instance, ability to do the kind of electronic stuff because a lot of stuff is being paid in cash, that sort of thing, it can't happen. But also because if you're in a community that is not used to paying tax, if it's not a problem, the way you look at that is you think, I am sending money off to a federal government and I am not sure if that's going to come back to me. So I send that to that federal government and I think, well, this could be misallocated in the sense that it could be allocated into cities, it could be allocated into places that I don't care about. The crucial thing is, even if you don't think that's going to happen, that perception is incredibly strong and leads to people not paying taxes. But the second thing is in areas, and this is often the case, where people disagree fundamentally with ruling parties. In ethnically divided countries, we point to, for instance, Ghana as an example of this. The problem is that people don't want to pay taxes to a government that they believe is not representative of them fundamentally. What we have on the ground here are people who are likely to be far more, even if they're somewhat divided, likely to be far more representative of the sorts of people we're talking about, insofar as they are able to identify that. And they also have, I think, a better sense that those people are going to be accountable. Even if that's not true, right? Even if it is the case that people you're not going to be able to hold these people accountable. You're like, oh, I know that guy, I see him in the street, and I think I can get him to do what I want. That makes you far more likely to collect taxes. So insofar as we get that revenue, we win what's going on. But the second reason in terms of why our service is better, no thank you, is to respond to what this OO said. So they just said that national governments in these countries have effective policy-making strategies. This is not true at all. Why is this? Because first of all, they're not necessarily smart or capable people. Oftentimes they're elected on the basis of being, popular religious leaders or popular celebrities. That sort of thing happens all the time in the developing world. But the second thing is, insofar as they are educated, oftentimes they come from, backgrounds of neoliberalism where that ideology is pushed. Because a lot of them are educated in the West, and particularly educated in a Western context where, for instance, financial austerity and the ideology of the IMF was particularly strong. No, thank you. But thirdly, even insofar as they're not like that, I think they become massively overzealous about the sorts of policies they want to implement because they don't don't have that accountability mechanism because they know they won't be voted out. And so they get ideas, for instance, about, well, our big thing is wind turbines, and we're going to build lots and lots of wind turbines because we think it's effective, because some consultant came in and said, really, wind turbines are the power of the future. Insofar as wind turbines are good, that's fine, but they implement the policy in places where there's no wind, or they put solar panels. Like, you go into communities that you don't know about, and you're like, yes, I'm going to build these things, and actually they just don't work. And also, I would point out, right, that insofar as services are provided from the top down by governments, right, so things like schools, education, hospitals, and people on the ground are massively in disagreement with the governments that have provided them, oftentimes they just refuse to engage with those services, refuse to attend them whatsoever. I will take back half.
You only get to use a predefined amount of money. If money is being used to build wind turbines, you don't get any of that money on your side of the house. That's not money that belongs to you because it's already predefined and it currently belongs to local councils.
I mean, clearly if we are giving more money to local governments than we are in the status quo, that improves the autonomy of those local governments. I don't really understand what's confusing about that. You know what, go for it, why not?
This motion is about you having ordinary people decide the budgets of municipal governments, not giving municipal governments more power. We can stand behind
Okay, this is the other challenge, right? So it's about giving ordinary people more power. Obviously, we wouldn't just select random ordinary people. The best way to mechanize that is through democratic elections, because that's how you assess consensus among ordinary people. Insofar as we're talking about local government, so it's more people on the ground, I think it's a perfectly legitimate way to make this debate. No, thank you. So secondly on this, why are local officials far more accountable? The first thing here is information. That we have the people on the ground have much better information about what's going on. Why? Firstly, because people see them on the street and are able to talk to them, and information proliferates in this community about budgets and the decisions being made in this budget that is not reliant upon media, because it's word of mouth. It is people talking about this sort of thing, which in the light, compare that with the federal government, right? Oftentimes you have media, which is very easy to manipulate. It's based in capitals where these governments are, and you have this national media, which is spreading either lies or just not telling people about the allocation of resources in the instance that it is corrupt. The second thing here is local press does exist in these communities, and it's far more difficult to manipulate. Why is that, right? There's just way more local, there's just like a local press in each of these constituencies, so the attempt to manipulate them on a national level is much more difficult to happen because there's just a lot more work to do. There's not just one newspaper editor, there's hundreds of them. Secondly, I think, in terms of ethnic voting and divides, the second reason that federal governments are not accountable is because people just won't vote them out, even if they do identify that they're not allocating resources in an effective way. They suggest that communities aren't homogenous. I would point out this point is most true where this is where the impact is largest, because communities are homogenous insofar as ethnic conflict has occurred, because you get segregation as a result of that occurring. So therefore, these communities are homogenous. But secondly, ethnic divides, even insofar as communities are living amongst each other, are far less extreme when you're talking about people you know, right? So I think people are less likely to be ethnically divided insofar as they can see someone and they talk about them. When they think about the ethnicity in the abstract, that's when that belief becomes the most fervent, right? Because you are identifying people who in the capital who you think are, you see just in the essential aspects of that ethnicity rather than your neighbors, the sorts of people you know. In terms of application of resources, we also point out you're far more likely to cooperate with NGOs who are likely to help you allocate these resources effectively. Why is that, right? National governments don't want to surrender a level of power to NGOs. They often see them as a Western imposition. Whereas on the ground, if you know that an NGO is going to be able to help you out, that ideology plays out far worse because you don't have those big political incentives of standing up to the West on a national level that you do on a local level, because on a local level, people see that as far more instrumental in terms of developing those services. For all these reasons, right, we reduce corruption. And insofar as corruption happens, it goes to local businesses, which are better. We get taxes and we do better for these communities as well as creating buy-in to democracy. We're very happy to propose. Thank you very much.
Thank that speaker very much, and I call upon the second speaker from the opening alt.
Yeah. Just wave your hand. I'll know what you're saying. You guys good?
I think since OG decided to talk about the status quo of local government, you guys are going to have a bit of a hard time trying to weigh this. But I think I'm going to explain to you on both sides why, if CG does the actual motion, but we also beat OG if you take their mechanism within it. Because note, Suzanne tells you specifically why it is that either local government or local individuals probably have centralized interest towards their area and investing in very specifically what they benefit and what they themselves, their family benefit from. And what particularly is important about that is that often does not align or is not seen to be stable enough for companies to invest. Because I think the biggest thing in this debate is how do we help developing countries get further along? Because recognize they don't have a lot of money to do it. And the difference in having economic investment is having education, is having people being able to get jobs, is able to grow up and build your healthcare and get people to have more meaningful lives. So I think that is how you're going to have to weigh this. I need to sit down. I think this is how you're going to have to weigh this, is based purely on how we metrically measure is it that we get most investment in this. So I think even if we get more tax on our sides, it's most important that we seem stable, and that is achieved through government. So let's talk firstly about the OG's claim that government versus local. And again, recognize this applies for both. First, they're celebrities, they're not qualified, so governments aren't any better. That is symmetric. Presumably local people could also not be qualified or not be chosen with it. Secondly, they're like, oh, they can hide it and they're corrupt. They can be corrupt. Again, symmetrical. Both groups can be corrupt. I think you're probably easier to hide on a local level because there's less oversight, because you are a less important body, so there's less incentive to oversight it. But thirdly, because you are the local, so if you don't rat yourself out, then people don't find out about it, so it's harder. So I think there's a lot of their harms they claim are symmetric on both sides. But what's more important, I think, the way is, I think larger governments probably have some ability to be held to account and some ability more of an incentive to watch them. Secondly, I think they have some degree of belief of duty to their citizens, and I think that's more important. And thirdly, I think because they do have wider plans and long-term plans, I think they're probably best suited towards getting it, because I think the most important thing is getting income. I think that's how we get growth within it. So recognize then... No, thank you. So let's talk about, firstly, why they say you get better policy. OG says, on the ground, and you know what works, that's why you get local policy. They keep being like, oh, wasn't it silly that time in Ghana? I don't actually think they tell you why it is likely local governments will be better at making decisions beyond the intuition pump that because you're there, you might to some degree care. I think the problem is they ignore that local also means you have your own incentives. And again, if you're an individual actor, you also have your own incentives. So you have an ability to be corrupt because you have less oversight, but also you have a self-interest to it. I think most people don't want to pay taxes. So I think you have an incentive not to increase the taxes in your area or not to try and do it. But I also think it looks like you wanting to help your mate out and build their business. So you give them the subsidy over another country or another company that might not be the best choice for you, but that's because that's your local interest. Comparatively, governments, because they don't have that attachment, have some degree of ability to weigh off what is more important for the country at large and more beneficial towards it. Secondly, I think that also applies more extreme if CG does the actual motion, that is individuals within it. Because I think if you care about your family and your own interest, you're probably not as interested in investing in things like infrastructure and FDI, because if you have a job but you want your kids to get an education, that's what you value. The problem is that automatically stagnates because it stops businesses from investing in the area, but secondly because they fear that you may behave like that, and they fear you may remove their subsidies even if you granted it 1 year. They are less likely to go to it. They are less likely to invest in it. Secondly, they say you only invest in major cities, and that's bad. I don't think they actually tell you why that's true. Growing up economies in countries around you, major cities, does trickle out and does benefit, because when there's more money in your economy, that looks like getting better healthcare system, that looks like getting better education, that looks like people getting more within it. I think the important thing is it does trickle out and does have a meaningful effect on how you grow from this. And note, when you are building up major cities, you get FDI. Thirdly, why is it, even if local have good intention, they are worse actors with it? Because I think the investment is lost in this. Not only because I think they are likely to make bad decisions as either individuals or local governments, for the reason I tell you that they're likely to favour themselves, they have their own investments first. But secondly and importantly, even if you have local governments who are doing a good job and this town invests in building up roads and incentivising it, if the town next to you is not doing that, that is not useful, because recognise these companies need chains of growth across the country to be able to invest in that. So that looks like why governments do national policies of infrastructure, so that they can incentivise and say you can get all around our country, you can build up offices in all these places. The problem with local is when it's being bitterly done, is even if some do it well, the way which others don't do it well, you can't get the benefit benefits from that, because if they can't get to your town because the 4 other towns haven't done infrastructure, that's of no use to you. I think that's significant why you don't get investment. Fourthly, I think they try and claim racism and like, oh, the dominant ethnicities are in charge of it. Firstly, I think it's worth noting I'm not clear why in the local government of OG, dominant ethnicities aren't still in charge of this, because they're more educated, because there's often legal prejudice to stop them, because there's systemic advantages they have. I think those are symmetrical concerns. But more importantly within it, I think minorities are still secularized and still excluded. But I also think you probably have a more personal incentive to do it, because recognize the point in which you know these people and you have a personal prejudice, I think you are more likely to apply it. I think governments, comparatively, while they can be prejudiced, have some duty to all members of the civilians of the state, so are less likely to actually prejudice, but secondly, can be held more accountable, because it's much harder to prove that your local government's refusing to give you any subsidies because of your ethnicity. It's easier to prove at a governmental level, a larger level, that more of you are being systemically opposed. So I don't actually think that changes. But more importantly, I think even if there are some towns where minorities suddenly get some power because by chance they are larger in this, overall they are being more actively harmed. More of them, because of the local towns where they are not the majority, they are being locked out of subsidies, they are not getting those afforded, they are being locked. So I actually think they are more meaningfully harmed. I think secondly and importantly, I think this divides and escalates, because the point at which the local groups are deciding on these ethnic groups and the local groups decide the majorities, I think this escalates ethnicity, because it's not just an abstract government prejudice, it's Frank down the road who keeps refusing to let your company grow. I think that actually escalates tensions because it's more personal. Because no, thank you. I think I'll take back half.
Yeah, so you say that local communities are bad at managing their money, and that's why the FDI investment won't come in. We can tell
No.
better at doing
To be clear, I don't say they're bad. I say there's reasons why they might be bad, but I say even if some of them aren't bad, I think others, because of their own priorities, won't all do it. And thirdly, I think because they don't think they're stable, because they already have pre-existing prejudice, because they don't know what you will change and won't know whether on a different year you'll invest and give subsidies to different people. That's why they seem less stable. So it's not about a claim that whether they're bad or good. It's that because they perceive to be less stable, and because they're not all choosing to do this, it is less of an ability for FDI to invest and less an incentive for these companies to go in. Because I think that is the way off. Because even if they're right about the buy-in and paying more taxes, when you have a poorer country that can't grow, then those taxes are not as valuable. Those taxes, just because you get more collection. Firstly, I have no idea why you can't just be better at collecting taxes. That sounds like a better solving for this. But secondly, I think even if they're right and that we get more buy-in and more taxes, I think that this is at the cost of companies and international bodies buying into them. This is really important, because if developing nations want to grow and compete in a globalized market, they need that investment. They need to be seen as markets. They need to be able to grow. At the end of this debate, you have to weigh what helps the people most, not just how do they feel about it, but what meaningfully changed their lives, and that's why you cite OO. Can I go?
Yes, of course.
Is the AC on? Lorna, do you need anything?
No, I just Okay, Fab, so when you feel the need to go on, please do. I now welcome the first speaker from the closing
Well, good. On closing government, the case that we're going to present to you is one that says that in reality, when it comes to helping people stay alive and helping them live lives that are meaningful, the biggest changes are oftentimes the smallest ones, the ones that are often overlooked. Whether it's Nick Servutis giving me this stopwatch, whether it's a small amount of money going to a family that means they can plan a little bit more for the future. The problem with opening opposition so far in this debate, and indeed the opening half as a whole, is we've had this big clash about whether local growth or national growth is good. But there's been no real explanation as to what the purpose of growth in the first place is. I am happy on proposition to say it's fine if we get a little bit more growth, or if these areas don't get to compete or become part of the entire national economy, if at the very least, people in the poorest areas finally get a little bit more money and are able to live a little bit more. So I'm going to say a couple things in this speech. I'm going to wade into this clash on allocation, but then the rest of my case is going to be independent of whether the allocation is good or bad. Even if the allocation is bad, we're going to say you get more business investment, and second of all, life in these communities gets better. Let's talk about allocation first. Before I actually delve into the clash, I want to make one rebuttal. OO gives us the absurd claim that, in these places, you're going to have some people who are are intimidating and like blackmailing people who are on this council. I find this to be the most absurd argument I've ever heard. For one, I see no reason as to why like police doesn't exist in these areas, but like even if it does, right? Like presumably we're talking about relatively small areas, at least the ones that are most important are the most kind of poor areas who tend to be the most self-sufficient and close-knit. That means two things. One, in general, the suffering that one individual faces is generally in some way similar to those of their neighbors. So I don't think there's really going to be the incredible like lack of similarity in interest that these guys say, which means I don't think anyone's going to be passionate enough to threaten you with a knife. But second of all, because these places are so tight-knit, I think if someone does threaten you with a knife, there's likely to be an incredible backlash in which you say, you are destroying this community, fuck off. No. So I think that's out of this debate. What's the clash itself? The clash goes something like this. OG tells us these governments are corrupt and top-down change is bad, whereas opening opposition tells us, well, the problem is these individuals in these areas will have a lack of expertise. How do we resolve this clash? I want to take opposition at their best and say, what does the best national policy in developing countries look like? Oftentimes, the national policies that are chosen tend to be ones that force most resources and most money into certain sectors. Oftentimes, this is like natural resources that they have a comparative advantage in, but oftentimes it can be like cheap manufacturing and so on. The problem is, because of the massive amount of investment that comes into these countries when you have this kind of comparative advantage, oftentimes the vast majority of national funds are located and funneled into these industries, because that's how you get quick growth in certain areas, and that's how you keep on getting investors coming back. But that means three problems for local investments. One, local politics is ignored in general. But I want to know, it's not just local politics. It's local politicians themselves. They don't get a vote. They don't get a big say. No one really wants to listen to them in Parliament because their interests don't align with the big growth development that the country is looking for. But that means, because local politicians want to get heard, there's an incentive for them to try and fold the interests of their local constituency into that national picture. But that's really problematic if you don't live in the oil-producing parts of Nigeria, for example, because those interests simply aren't aligned, which means that whatever policy you're pushing for in that government isn't something that's going to lead to meaningful change. But the only way you can get votes on those things is if you make it tangential to the interests of your people. But second of all, it means that the allocation that these places get in the first place is tiny. These guys say that you want to create an industry that's sustainable and one that's aligned with the rest of the country. But that's not going to happen because these local governments don't care in the first place about these areas because they're superfluous to their general interest. So any investment that these guys say is going to happen just won't, because the investment doesn't get there in the first place, and politicians aren't gunning for those things that they need. Under our side, I think it's fine that people don't care about oil or what's comparatively advantageous in their money. Their interest regarding this funding is just going to be about getting more money in the places that they need, and once they get a little bit more money themselves, I think they'll be more enfranchised. I think they'll have more of a political say. Second point then. Business investment. The claim we get from opening opposition here is that investors will see this thing as risky because they don't really trust people. I actually don't think that's true. I think investors will see this as a massive opportunity. Oftentimes investors are very scared of investing in local communities because that seems actually really risky because the well-being of these communities is oftentimes dependent upon political decisions. So if something changes in this area, there's an economic downturn or there's some natural problem, like you essentially get no money on your investment. But second of all, because there's strong authoritarian governments that oftentimes exist, they're afraid of people being exploited by those governments. Under our side, there's a much better incentive to invest in individuals because you know two things about their power over politics is true. One, it's stronger because they have a direct say in how the budget is proportioned and their friends and their family are on it. And second of all, that power is constant. It cannot go away. What does that mean? I want to present you the example of something like microloans. I think that you're going to get a lot more microloans going to people under our side for two reasons. One, they're a lot more profitable under our side, right? Even if you do funnel all of your money into an investment on agriculture, if that means that like one farm gets slightly better technology and can make slightly more money, if you give them that microloan, they can take it a fucking long way because of the fact that they can invest that in their own education. Whereas under their side, when they're worried about how money is going to be allocated, that's not true. But second of all, I just think more people in these areas are going to accept those microloans because oftentimes under their side, you have to leave home to get an education to do so. But under our side, you don't need to do that because you feel as though you can make a difference at home and there's more of an incentive for you to take that money. Oftentimes, it's microloans that pull people out of poverty and pull particularly women out of poverty. In a world in which they can make more money and they can get education, they can go farther with their lives, that's how they pull themselves out of poverty. I don't care about the general country's economic growth opening.
Even if you belie this stuff about the incentives of governments, surely incentivizing any FDI to come into it on a purely utilitarian calculus means means more people in jobs, more people in work, and that's a benefit. Why do we care about microloans when they're actually a very unsuccessful way
we're
of dragging people out of poverty?
We're saying that FDI doesn't come to these places in the first place. If you're investing in Nigeria, it's going to be going into the oil industries, not in the countries, not in the parts that have nothing to do with the oil industries. At least under our side, when you know that individuals can push for things that will support their lives on the ground, even if they're not traditionally profitable ones, that means they make more money. Final point, even if the allocation is done badly, we get better life in communities. Small changes make massive difference. These guys say that they're going to make bad decisions because they prioritize their family, they don't have enough expertise, and they have historical sides. But they never actually justified why good growth needs to be long-term growth. Small money can make a lot. One, it gives you a lot more freedom. Oftentimes in these places there are massive patriarchal structures, and it's very small things that stop women from working. The fact that they have to take kids to school or care for the house. In a world where they can push for things like school buses and school lunches, it's far easier for them to be able to start working and live lives on their own. Second of all, even if you just get a little bit of money in the short term because your like dying farming industry is giving you some more profits, you can finally make some short-term savings, which you can weather costs that oftentimes kill people in the short term. That doesn't exist under their side for two reasons. One, because long-term policies create long-term change. You need to set up a new industry. You need to let uncompetitive ones die to make sure that this long-term growth happens. In that sense, in that time, people will die. But second of all, short-term jobs they get are often temporary because it's about building infrastructure, whereas under our side, there's an incentive for people on the ground to ensure the stability of their jobs. I am so proud to propose.
Thank that speaker very much, and call for the extension speaker from Athens. You're here.
You ready? 3 things in this first speech. Firstly, what is this debate and what is it not? Secondly, how do we get development? Thirdly, democracy. Firstly, what is this debate? Notice this debate is not national governments v local governments. If they wanted that, the motion would have been this House would give more power to municipal governments and local governments. Giving more power to local municipal governments is not mutually exclusive on either side of this debate. And notice that is what all of opening government and closing governments benefits hinge on. They never once talk about how they get this group of people together. I'll talk about the example they give of it there where they try and say that this debate is just democracy. I think there's a reason we say we don't live in Western liberal participatory budgets. We live in democracies, and that would be what this motion would be about. It is about local people, ordinary Reeds, non-elected, working with a predetermined budget in order to decide where it is allocated to. They make proposals and then pitch it to the government. So it is not just that they are the government now, as Proposition would like to say. They are separate to them. Finally, I'd like to say the mischaracterization of what municipal governments are like here, local governments. They can have hundreds of thousands of people in them. It is just slightly smaller than the federal government in some cases. There's no reason why you know them all by hand, why they go to the same schools as you. I think that was a mischaracterization. 2 points of extraneous rebuttal before I go on. Firstly, closing governments say local governments are bad because they try to appeal to the federal government. They don't even tell us what's in it for these local governments to appeal to the federal government. Is it so they can get more money? Usually that's determined by how many people are within your local government, and so they can't really change that unless they're saying that they're going to try and make everyone have more kids. But also, people elect the federal government too, and so I don't understand why the federal government has an incentive to screw over individuals on the ground if they're going to be electing them for a federal thing as well. That made no sense. Then they say, they don't tell us why it's better to prioritize long-term growth over short-term growth. Look, if you get a microloan to buy a car, what road do you drive it on? Are you able to get all your microloans together to build roads, to build hospitals? You can buy books for your kid, but you don't have a teacher. It's just intuitive as to why you need some sort of long-term growth in order for the short-term things you get to go further and make them useful. Why do we get better development? Firstly, about cooperation between local governments and organisations in aid. Because OG are wrong when they say that the money of local governments only comes from the federal government in taxes. Especially in developing countries, so much of their budget comes from foreign aid of other countries, from NGOs and charities who directly give to the local government and tell them to spend that money. Crucially, those organisations cooperate with the local governments for a very specific goal, targeting a particular disease, wanting to eradicate Ebola or blindness, targeting a particular goal like education for girls as opposed to just education overall. These organizations are no longer going to contribute to the budgets of these local governments if they cannot guarantee that this will not just be used for education of boys, education of wealthy boys, the healthcare budget just going to lowering the cost of Viagra. There's obviously a reason as to why they want to achieve a specific goal, and that is a large part of these budgets, and it's important for them. The impact of this argument, which is not touched on so far, is that they will lose a vital source of income because they don't have the ability to make those promises anymore, to say that that's where that money will go, that they can engage in a 5-year long-term plan, that it will eradicate a particular goal. And so there's no incentive for those organizations and the multinational organizations to help them. The second reason why you get worse development is because you don't get a holistic or cohesive form of development. So even if we take proposition at their best, and say each individual is able to make a good decision about, and each, this council makes like a good decision about where to invest the money. It'll probably be scattergun goods. It's unlikely to be part of a strategic 5 or 10 year long development plan for that area, because you don't have the authority to do that or cooperate with these other councils and with the other organizations that are required in order to make those things possible. So even if they say, you know, we want to build housing in this area, it mightn't occur to them that they need to do the non-intuitive things like funding water to go to those areas or building roads to go to those areas, rather than just the immediate good of funding houses. They're the things, crucially, that companies and firms look for, as opposed to organizations in aid, when they cooperate with an area. They want to see that even though the airport is not there now, it will be in 5 or 10 years' time, and so it's okay for them to start building a factory. When you lose the ability to make long-term promises, you can't attract them. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
NGOs obviously still have leverage to get local governments to do what they want, because they can just pull funding if that's not occurring.
Okay, so then your case is that you'll presumably be able to do that with all the federal government as well, and you can just manipulate people. But they just, if you want to say, if your benefit is that people should be able to make this decision and it's beneficial, but also that they're just completely able to be manipulated by pulling funding if they don't do what they want them to do, then it's hard to see how you get your benefits. Why do we get better long-term developments? Because this response to CG, they say, it's good because you get things like microloans. But obviously, if these things were an obvious good, people would want them and would ask their elected representative to get them for them. Crucially, we need a person in charge who has an incentive in long-term payoffs. Because short-term payoffs like tourism, we think that, like opening opposition mentioned, these local governments do anyway. But that they also have an incentive to do is have the much higher payoff of a long-term plan, which results in a huge factory opening up in their area and loads of jobs being created. That only happens when you have individuals making these decisions who have that long-term strategic payoff as opposed to short-term payoffs. So even if all these governments ignore minorities, at least those long-term strategic payoffs are likely to help them in sort of a rising tide lifts all boats capacity. Finally, on the way in on democracy. What does this look like? Presumably, it's a random selection of citizens that discuss and put forward proposals. I'm just going to say that OG are not allowed to say that this is just elected people because it's counter to the motion. We don't, so it's not a local v national government, it's about local governments exclusively and their allocations. So we think that this is worse for democratic buy-in for 2 reasons. Firstly, there are completely unelected people making your decisions. Why would I even bother voting for an elected representative if the decisions are going to be made by some other council, like a citizens' assembly, and my elected representative had no power? Why would I ever vote for them? That trickles down into the way in which you interact and how you form voting habits, whether you vote on a federal level. Secondly, you need trust in the idea of representatives for democracy to work at all, because direct democracy in any capacity is just not functional. And so at some point you need people to buy into the idea that someone can act on their behalf reasonably well. This erodes the idea that anyone is able to do that, even the people closest to you, so it's unclear why you'd buy into that overall. People buy into democratic organizations and are willing to pay taxes when they see that they are functional. We have shown that they are likely to be much less functional, and also people don't have a reason to trust in them, so they're less likely to buy into them, less likely to support them long term, and get worse outcomes. Proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker very much, and I call upon the whip speaker from Gut Bench to close the entire side. Here,
Oh no, this is so small. Sorry, can I go? Sorry.
I also want to clarify what this debate is and what this debate isn't. Because look, I think that it's great when they tell us about building hospitals and building roads. This is not what local communities do. Crucially, it's also not important right now for a lot of these local communities. Because right now, what we care most about is that the people who don't have sanitation, who don't have water, who can't educate their children, can actually help themselves do that. We still think we get the same number of roads and hospitals because the national budget is not changed. We are, however, going to tell you why we help develop those local communities better, and also Alberta's extensions and why those actually matter. I think they completely discount Alberta's extensions about microloans and specifically about helping people on a small local level. Firstly, I tell you why there's moral force behind making sure that we prioritize specifically local communities. Because even though this isn't a national versus local debate, for some reason it has become such on top half, and I'm going to try and win it and also make it relevant to this motion. So Albie tells you microloans are really important. Why do people get microloans? Who does it go to? Who gives them? Microloans are small amounts of money that people get to start businesses. They're often the most impactful way to help people, specifically women, because a lot of microloan companies specifically give loans to women. However, the communities that are chosen for these microloans are often very, very subject to the whims of the local government. So more foreign companies are more likely to give more finance to people when they know that they control the external environment and can control risks. That is what Alberta's extension is, that you give people fundamentally more agency over the money that they receive, both in the local government way and in the microloan way, which more money, better, good, more things. Okay, so I think that's the first thing. Also, microloans don't buy you hospitals. That's not the point we tried to make. Secondly, they try to tell us that accountability is going to be decreased and that there's going to be less trust. This is ridiculous. You trust the people you eat with, you sleep with, you work with. But fundamentally, I think more people involved in process means better decision, better accountability because more people to look after each other. Opening half gestures at this but doesn't make it explicit. Nepotism. They tell you, look, so they tell you national level is best because the national government is really responsible and impartial. Look, the national government's really far away. They're not exactly sending out a budgetary review of the money they're spending. They're way likely to say, actually, we don't really care about the local government there because they're not voting anyway because they have very little sanitation or access to this. So my point is, national governments are really bad at this and actually allocating resources to small communities, but also nepotism is so much worse. Malaysia had a fucking scandal where a man spent millions of dollars on his daughter's wedding. For Christ's sake, when you give power to a small group of officials, it's way more likely that they're going to prioritize their families. This is also true on a local representative level, and that's how it's relevant to this motion. Specifically, when local representatives get money, they're likely to funnel it towards their families and help themselves. And importantly, funnel money away and exploit the local communities that they're responsible for. That's really bad. Okay, I now want to talk about top half more explicitly. Talk about allocation of resources. OG said more money goes to local governments because we just spend money better. But Alberto tells you something way more important. He says this fundamentally changes the behavior of voters on a local level because they now see money that they can actually spend. They feel the money in their hand and they feel it going towards their kids. This is important because they didn't do that before. And crucially, this means that they're likely to vote for the national representative that they talk about about that are more likely to funnel money towards local governments. This is important because look, right now we think it's not important what the GDP figure of the nation is. What is important is the wealth distribution of that nation. It isn't important if the GDP in Athens is like skyrocketing if the rest of it isn't, as we talked about. Also, Greece isn't a developing country. The point is, it doesn't matter if one place is getting a lot of funding if local communities aren't. They ask us, but why would people vote for someone who fucks them over? Usually it's because they don't understand there is another way to actually get that funding. Consider that a lot of developing nations are also nascent democracies. No, thank you. So for them, feeling the fact that they can spend the money is something quite new. Also, additionally, consider the fact that, like, oftentimes it's just really fucking hard for them to know how money is being spent on a national level. And, like, even on a local representative level, they're unlikely to actually feel any progress. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is how do we get more money into these countries, foreign direct investment, basically more money, more things, more happiness. Cool. Okay, so they tell us FDI won't come into these countries, and their logic is the following. It's threefold. Firstly, no trust in that the outcomes of these people are going to be better. No trust in the people. Secondly, worse outcomes. And thirdly, it's less predictable. On the first two, I contest the no trust thing, right? And I contest it on a foreign direct investment level, but also on a charity level. I think oftentimes aid and foreign charities specifically refuse to give money because they do not trust local government. This means that instead of having money that the local community can spend, they send white people to build them toilets and houses that the community then has to rebuild at night so as not to offend the poor little gap year students. My point is, when you make it so that local charities know that the money is going to people, you are more likely to get more money, specifically money that people can spend and spend in ways that gives them agency, not in ways that white people tell them they should be spending it. But also, the next thing I want to talk about, worse outcomes. I think, it's sort of like probably some worse outcomes, probably some better outcomes. The third, but overwhelmingly better. The third thing is they say it's less predictable. Let's think about that a little bit. This means that right now, if foreign direct investment companies think that people are going to spend money against their own interests, I don't think that's true. But importantly, if foreign direct investment companies think that the local government representative is likely to be predictable, that's probably because they're giving him a lot of money to do so, right? This probably means that the local representative is easier to buy out and easier to funnel the local government funds, which we already know are scarce, into things that aren't benefiting people and are instead benefiting this mysterious FDI donor. I contest that this is more likely to not be an FDI donor. It's more likely to be a local business that has given the local official money to spend government funds according to them. This means instead of building a school, they can't build schools. Instead of investing more money into buying school supplies, or making a new playground, they're going to spend money to help that business. I think it's harder to buy out whole communities. This means that firstly, if foreign direct investment does happen, it happens in ways that actually help people, but also it's just better for everyone. For all of these reasons, please propose.
I thank that speaker, and I call upon the whip speaker from the up bench to close the debate as a whole. Here.
I'm going to do three things in this speech. I'm going to do some responses and just clarify some things that are important and don't fit into what we perceive to be the most important points of clash in the debate. Then I'm going to talk to you about, I'll read the name now, democratic buy-in, and then I'm going to talk to you about what interests change and what the significance of those changes are. First response. Closing governments say this debate is particularly important because now local governments can give more microloans. They tell you that the mechanism for this happening is that companies can give money to local governments and then they will give that money to private citizens. First response to this, there's no reason why that can't just happen without the local government being in the middle, right? So why can't you just privately give money to citizens if you really want to give microloans as a company? Why do you have to give it through the government, which then allocates the microloan? Second response, Insofar as this is a debate about like structures that fundamentally do have some element of corruption or people being self-interested, they give us no reason why those microloans aren't allocated in a nepotistic way. Why are they given to women when the perception is that women shouldn't work or have to be homemakers? Why are they given to people who need microloans more to like start businesses or get themselves out of like minority communities that are discriminated against, when the people, the majority of the people presumably on this mystical council will be people who do not believe or do not support the rights of those particular people? They give us no reason why those microloans perform any benefit for the most needy citizens of society, the ones they claim to protect. The third thing is that this is actually just usually done by banks and charities. Like, genuinely my thing about saying that it should be done privately is genuinely in a status quo thing that is done at the moment. Like, the microloan money comes from people who are interested in seeing a return on that money. Banks recognise that it's profitable. Charities recognise that it is important. So charities will often be the people who give microloans to women and minorities because they recognise the importance of that. But fourthly, insofar as this is economically effective, insofar as it does help bring communities out of poverty, it's so unclear why a local government can't just do that if you lobby for it, or if you ask them to do it, or if just it gives a return that means that people vote for you on your next election. Like, they don't explain any of the mechanisms that mean they can't get their impacts in other ways. Note that what we are supporting is the status quo, and microloans do exist in the status quo, and push for microloans does exist in the status quo. We would say that that is not a harm on our side of the house. Second of all, these things are not just local communities. Like, it's not like your pals and people you went to school with. Like, municipal governments are just not national governments, right? So they are huge. The populations of these countries is like millions and millions of people. Municipal governments can have a population of millions of people. The council that you're giving control of the budget of a government with millions of people is presumably, first of all, not elected because that's not in the motion, and second of all, not able to properly represent their communities. The accountability that they make in, the capacity to call out these people, the capacity to make them feel any pain for the decisions they make, that doesn't exist on their side of the house, because these people are given control of money that they can do literally whatever they want with, and nothing happens to them. You can't bribe people if, like, you don't know who they are. That's the problem with this debate. There's no capacity to have accountability. They don't guarantee that. So let's talk about democratic buy-in, right? Because first thing, that response also ties into democratic buy-in, because opening government claim that the reason why you get democratic buy-in is because you know who's doing it, you do things for your community specifically, and you don't move along ethnic lines. There's no proof why any of those things don't happen, right? There's no reason why you wouldn't support your ethnic community. There is no reason why you would not, why people would be able to hold you accountable if a government is so big as it likely is. Like, this isn't a government of like 1,000 people. Those don't exist in any part of the world. Local governments exist because national governments are ineffective at providing services for smaller numbers of people, but that number is not 1,000 people. It's a much bigger number than that. No. And so that means that you don't actually see where it goes, and that means that people do not feel that they are democratically elected or have any control over what is happening to the money. Aisling explains to you that this is money that is controlled by random individuals, and what that means for this debate and for what people's perception of democracy is that any tax money that you do spend, any money that the government does make off, pollution in your area because FDI gives money back to them, all of that money is in the control of people who you have no capacity to control what they do. You have no way of predicting what they'll do, and it could literally mean that your business fails. It could mean that your community becomes poorer and you can't attract any sort of investment. It could mean that your opportunities in the job market are screwed. And all of those things mean that people do not buy into the democratic system insofar as they feel like they cannot control any money that the government is taking off them or that they are losing, and it's being controlled by people who they have no capacity to hold accountable. You need trust for democracy to work. These people do not believe in democracy at the point where it does not work. Yeah, go.
Our policy radically increases the power of local government on the level at which our impacts are true, so the 1,000, 2,000 people, there's no reason to suggest we wouldn't do otherwise, thereby increasing the effective participation of ordinary citizens in the budgets of their local areas. That is a legit interpretation.
The info slide lends itself to pre-existing municipal and local governments and pre-existing budgets. That is what the info slide says. So you do not get smaller local governments, you do not get bigger budgets, but also insofar as you do, all that you're propping is a better local government. We're okay with better local governments. Just create better local governments. Like, you don't have elected representatives. You don't have people who necessarily control this in a better way. Like, if you just want better municipal governments, we have
presumably we have the power to also have that on our side of the house. We would be fine with that, and it would do a lot better in terms of these interests. Let's talk about the interests, right? Because OO says, like, people are selfish and it's going to change year to year, so that's bad because it doesn't attract investment. What Aisling explains to you is that people don't at the moment see the wider importance of planning and long-term planning and consistency and coherence in terms of what local government policy is, how it fits into national policy, how it fits into municipal policy, but also how it fits into local government's actions in the past and local government's actions in the future. She explains to you through a mechanism that does not exist before she speaks in this debate about long-term strategic payoffs, because you need to be re-elected, but over the course of 4 to 5 years, if you are able to make yourself palatable for re-election to the population, that is a priority. So insofar as you do things for your ethnic community, which probably still does happen, insofar as you still prop up agriculture, even if you shouldn't, which probably still does happen, you also need to make decisions that are beneficial for other members of the population or a wider majority of people, because that is how you ensure your re-election. That means that you make better strategy. CG say, you just need little things. First response, then just ask for them. Like, genuinely, that's how lobbying local governments work, and they have an incentive to respond to that. But second of all, what if you get a greater return on long-term projects, right? What if investing in infrastructure like sanitation systems, like water systems, is a thing that improves your quality of life so much more than a car now ever could have, or a book now ever could have? And that's the reason why we have government in the first place, because they're able to understand overall, and they're given a budget overall that improves your quality of life in the long term. And if that's not working, you get to not re-elect them, and another person comes in and does that for you overall, but you do not have the power to change an infrastructure system yourself, and that's why we need local governments to do it. So basically what Aisling explains to you is that we make things, like, this does not happen on their side of the house. They do not get the long-term planning, they do not get reliance on statistics, they do not get accountability, and they just continue to entrench the problems that currently exist in municipal governments, and they do not get any of the positives. Please oppose.
Thank that speaker, and indeed all speakers for the debate. Please cross the floor and shake hands.